Hi, everyone. Today I'm going to be discussing foreign affairs in the early years of the United States, beginning with the presidency of Thomas Jefferson and continuing on through the presidency of James Monroe. So Thomas Jefferson became president after the election of 1800. Jefferson was a pacifist and came to subscribe to Washington's policy of neutrality. Thus, immediately upon taking office, Jefferson began to shrink the size of the Army and the Navy. However, challenges overseas forced Jefferson to bend his principles and get the United States more and more involved in foreign policy. So the first major challenge originated with pirates from the North African Barbary states. The Barbary pirates had demanded bribes from the United States in order to guarantee the protection of U.S. merchant ships that were trading in the Mediterranean. Both Washington and John Adams had paid these bribes to the Barbary pirates, but now the Pasha of Tripoli was demanding even more protection money. Jefferson, unwilling to pay, was reluctantly thrown into war with Tripoli in order to protect American free trade in the Mediterranean. Now, the war lasted 4 years from 1801 to 1805, and in the end, it resulted in a peace treaty with Tripoli. Though the war didn't constitute a major victory for the United States, it did help the young country gain more respect overseas. A much larger issue involved the beginning of the Napoleonic Wars. So the French Revolution of the 1790s had allowed Napoleon Bonaparte to come to power in France by 1799. The ascension of Napoleon would lead to over a decade of warfare in Europe that would continually test Jefferson's commitment to pacifism and non-interventionism. The first example of this involved the Louisiana Territory in 1802. So Spain transferred the Louisiana Territory to France and revoked America's right of deposit in New Orleans, which had been negotiated as part of Pinckney's Treaty in 1795. The seizure of the Louisiana Territory by Napoleon was very alarming to the United States, who feared war with France in order to regain access to New Orleans. So Jefferson dispatched James Monroe with orders to purchase New Orleans from France. Instead, the American ambassadors were offered the entire Louisiana Territory for the price of $15 million. So the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 ended that standoff over New Orleans. But it was just going to be the beginning of American tensions with Europe, which is going to continue to grow and grow as the decade progresses. So by 1804, Jefferson had been reelected, and Great Britain and France were locked in a struggle for control over Europe in the Napoleonic Wars. So the United States wanted to remain neutral and trade with both countries, but neither European power was willing to allow American ships to trade goods with their rival. So both France and Great Britain began to stop American ships and seize American vessels. However, Great Britain's navy dominated the seas at this time, so they were viewed as the greater threat to American neutrality. Even worse, the British continually impressed American seamen. So impressment was the practice of kidnapping American sailors and forcing them to work in the British Navy. Over 6,000 U.S. citizens were taken off of American ships between 1808 and 1811, a clear threat to American neutrality and the rights of U.S. citizens abroad. So things get worse in 1807 when a British warship fires on an American ship only 10 miles off the coast of Virginia. This incident became known as the Chesapeake Affair, and it outraged Americans, many of whom were now calling for war. Now, Jefferson responds instead by passing the Embargo Act. So the Embargo Act forbade the export of all U.S. goods to foreign countries. Jefferson reasoned that warring European nations were dependent on American exports, and that eliminating these exports would not only keep the U.S. out of the war, but also force European countries to acknowledge American rights at sea. Unfortunately, the Embargo Act was a complete disaster. So the Embargo Act crippled the merchants of New England, and farmers in the South were left with piles of cotton, wheat, and tobacco that they could not export. So thus, the Embargo Act actually harmed the U.S. economy far more than the European countries that it was actually trying to punish. So the public outcry finally led to a replacement law known as the Non-Intercourse Act, which was passed in the final days of Jefferson's presidency. The Non-Intercourse Act reestablished American trade with all countries of the world except France and Great Britain. So in 1808, James Madison was elected the next president. Madison was a Democratic Republican and a disciple of Thomas Jefferson. Madison continued Jefferson's policy of peaceful coercion when it came to dealing with France and Great Britain. And we can see this continued policy with Macon's bill number 2. However, despite these efforts, the British would continue to impress American sailors, and these violations of U.S. sovereignty and neutrality would be one of the major reasons for the War of 1812, which would break out during Madison's presidency. So, a second cause of the War of 1812 concerned the United States' relationship with Native Americans in the Ohio River Valley. Native Americans were not included in the new government under the Constitution, and the U.S. viewed Native Americans as a foreign power. During Washington's presidency, the government had fought a series of wars against Native Americans in order to gain control of land in the Northwest Territory. The Battle of Fallen Timbers and the subsequent Treaty of Greenville, signed in 1795, forced Native Americans to cede land in the Northwest Territory to the United States. Many Native Americans viewed the Treaty of Greenville as a betrayal and were unsatisfied with its terms. One such leader was Tecumseh, a Shawnee Indian who began to create a new confederacy that attempted to unite all tribes east of the Mississippi River. Tecumseh and his brother, known as the Prophet, preached against American ownership of land and the influence of Western culture on Native peoples. Americans in the West became convinced that the British were supporting Tecumseh's efforts and arming the Native Americans with supplies from Canada. This only further strained the relationship between the United States and Great Britain leading up to the War of 1812. Now, a third cause of the War of 1812 was the rise of a new group of congressmen known as the War Hawks. These men hailed primarily from the south and western parts of the United States, and they included people such as Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, and Felix Grundy. The War Hawks were eager for war with Great Britain. Not only were they angered by British impressment and Indian attacks on the frontier, but they also saw the war as an opportunity to gain new lands from Great Britain and Canada. These War Hawks would help push President Madison to ask for a declaration of war by 1812. So the War of 1812 was the first time the United States ever officially declared war. You don't need to know the battles of the war, just that most of the fighting took place along the Canadian-American border. Overall, it was, in comparison to the Napoleonic Wars, which were going on at the same time, a rather small war involving about 6,000 American casualties. But it had large consequences for the United States and its standing in the world. The Treaty of Ghent officially ended the War of 1812 after 2 years of fighting. In the treaty, both sides agreed to end fighting with no exchange of territory. The treaty made no mention of impressment, Indian attacks on the frontier, or any of the major causes for the war. Thus, essentially, the United States had fought Britain to a draw. However, the war had bigger implications than just the terms of the treaty. For one, the United States had gained greater respect from countries overseas. Many countries, including Great Britain, recognized America's growing power, and this gave American diplomats more power to negotiate. Tecumseh's Confederacy was defeated at the Battle of Thames during the War of 1812, which crushed any hope of a lasting Indian Confederacy in the Northwest Territory. This development allowed Americans to turn their sights on westward expansion and migration in the years following the war. So these developments encouraged Americans to take bolder action overseas. See you later.
This is Mr. Crayson coming at you with another video, this time on nationalism and sectionalism in the early American government. So nationalism and sectionalism, a division based on regional interests, are simultaneously happening and growing throughout the early American nation. How is that possible? That's the question for today. First up, the Louisiana Purchase. So in 1803, Thomas Jefferson was president, and he's a Democratic Republican. They are strict constructionists, unlike the Federalists, who were loose constructionists. What does that mean? Well, Jefferson would say the only thing a president or Congress or courts can do at a national level is what the Constitution says it can. And in this case, he didn't want all of Louisiana. That wasn't on his mind. He wanted the port of New Orleans, which had changed hands from Spain to France. And so the deposit on the New Orleans port that was given to us previously in Pinckney's treaty was now gone. And Jefferson wants that back. He sends diplomats to go buy this back. Napoleon is struggling in France. He's fighting against Britain. And with the recent Haitian Revolution of Toussaint Louverture, he also lost Haiti. So America right now for him is just a losing battle. And he's willing to sell it off, all this territory that France has. And so he offers for $15 million to the Americans. So America takes the deal. And now we've doubled the size of the country. Jefferson does have some scruples with it. You know, he became a loose constructionist essentially for a moment there. I'm sure many sleepless nights were lost over this, but ultimately he's going to say, well, this is a power of a president to usher in a treaty. And this particular treaty doubled the size of the United States. He's also able to sleep at night because this now makes his agrarian vision for America more possible. The idea that now we have all this new farmland and it will be a nation of farmers. It also opens up sectional tensions between the North and the South as, will this new land have slaves or not? In the case of Marbury versus Madison of 1803, Chief Justice John Marshall is going to give the central government way more power by creating judicial review. Here, Chief Justice John Marshall and the Supreme Court got original jurisdiction to decide the case. And Marshall, a Federalist, probably would have loved to have another Federalist judge in a lower court like Marbury, and, deciding to go that way could have been a victory for the Federalists. However, he sees the bigger picture. So the Judiciary Act of 1789 had a clause that allowed for this case to be directly seen within the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. Marshall thought that that was an oversight, that this should have been something decided by a lower court first, and therefore deemed Judiciary Act of 1789 unconstitutional. And that's how he created judicial review. The courts can check laws made by the legislative branch and the executive orders by the executive branch, and any action taken by Congress or the president for that matter. This is a huge step for central government getting more power. Marshall's going to do this again and again. Another big case to know, McCulloch versus Maryland. In this case, a state doesn't have the right to tax a federal entity because the power to tax is the power to destroy. And the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution says the national government is supreme to the states. The outcome of the War of 1812 is also really important in knowing how the national pride in America grew to a peak. It essentially ends in a tie. The Treaty of Ghent in 1814 is not like giving America all these new things, and in fact is just essentially keeping things the way they are. Any new grounds America got in Canada from Britain are wiped away. Like everything's kind of wiped clean for all intents and purposes. This is a draw of sorts. But if you go toe to toe with the biggest military in the world twice and live to tell the tale, you've got something to brag about. And that is the case with the American nation at this time. Not to mention in the Battle of New Orleans, where Andrew Jackson becomes this famous general for the Americans, they absolutely trounced the British, and it gives this sense that America won the war big when it really didn't. But we also said that sectionalism was simultaneously happening to some degree, right? And it does. The Hartford Convention takes place in Hartford, Connecticut, and it's a group of Federalists that are meeting. At the convention, they grumbled about the Democratic Republicans and about how this war was a Democratic Republican war and it was never going to end. They're literally meeting while the Treaty of Ghent is being signed. Again, news doesn't travel fast, right? The Federalists also entertain the idea of secession. It's dismissed very rapidly, but that fact gets out to the general public, and the Federalists look as un-American as can be. So this is going to be the death knell of the Federalists. This is where the Federalists lose their favor as a party from about 1816 all the way to about 1824, 1828. We are going to have pretty much one party that is dominating. It is the Democratic Republicans. This period will be known as the Era of Good Feelings. Can you guess why? So hopefully through this video you saw examples of how nationalism at first dominated the first 20 years of the 1800s, and then we saw sectionalism take over, and by the mid-1820s started to become more dominant to the point where we're going to have a civil war by 1861. Thanks for listening and have a really great rest of the day.